Rebuild Local News Coalition was formed about 3 years ago to pull together almost 30 different national and state groups that work on local news, to try to get everyone sort of rowing in the same direction. There are lots of different groups, and they were all trying different things or not focused on public policy. And so our view is that, I don't need to tell you about what your own life is like, but that the struggles of local news are a national crisis, and a national crisis for democracy. You've probably heard all these scary numbers of 2 newspapers a week shutting down across the country on average, about a 60% decline in the number of reporters since 2004. You have thousands of communities that have no local news, thousands that have what are called ghost newspapers, and we have to invent a whole new term for something I was just heard about the other day, which is there's a paper in Salinas, California, that is a daily newspaper with no reporters. And I thought that must be a strange anomaly, but in fact it's not. There are quite a number of daily newspapers with no reporters. So the national situation is really challenging. You know it from the ground up, and it is why I always say, to folks like you, that as we did with the Report for America Corps members when we would send them out to work in local newsrooms, that what you are doing is a public service profession. And what you are doing, and this is true not just for the reporters, but for the ad sales team and everyone else involved in making it possible for that reporter to do that work, are doing a public service profession. And increasingly, it's a long process of trying to educate people. Journalists and news folks have not been particularly good at explaining ourselves to the public always, and the value of local news. We haven't really had to until pretty recently, because it was a relatively robust industry until recently. So, and in fact, when I talk to people about the local news crisis, to regular people about the local news crisis, or a shortage or anything like that, the first thing they say is, what on earth are you talking about? I'm deluged with information. There's news everywhere. How are you talking about shortage? And you say, well, what's your local news situation like? And that's where, it's the decline in local reporting. And of course, we view the solution to this as having 3 parts to it. The most important part is basically just what you're doing already. It's just continuing to evolve your business models to make your businesses succeed and serve your communities. There's sort of no substitute for that. But we have all become increasingly convinced that there needs to be 2 additional things. One is actually philanthropy. More money from the philanthropic sector to help buttress certain parts of the local news system. The program that I co-founded and used to run, Report for America, would place, it's like Teach for America for reporters, puts reporters into local newsrooms, pays half the salary in the first year and a third of the salary in the second year. Have had quite a few in West Virginia, and have placed over 600 reporters into almost 300 local newsrooms around the country. And we essentially get money from national foundations and essentially help put that into the reporter salaries. And by the way, half of those 300 newsrooms are for-profit entities. Philanthropy does not mean you have to be a nonprofit news organization. For-profit news organizations need to be in that game too. The Seattle Times, I was just talking to the other day, something like a third of their newsroom costs are now subsidized by philanthropic organizations. So it's something that can really help commercial entities as well. But the third part is public policy. We've become convinced that this just absolutely has to be a really big part of addressing what is a national crisis and threat to democracy and to communities. And that's honestly can be kind of a scary thought to anyone in the news business, right? Like the thought of going to the government to get help makes us all uncomfortable. And our message is that, well, first of all, it does need to be done because of how serious the threat is. This isn't just a threat to, your jobs. It's a threat to democracy, and there's all sorts of evidence for, when you don't have local news, you have more corruption and less participation, and communities fray, and you know all this. And that, I just did a story for the Atlantic magazine that basically said saving local news would pay for itself, because one of the things that local news does is, shines a spotlight on something that results in fines to the government or consumers being saved money. We had an example, just a little example, but it was so telling, of a reporter in in Utah, who this just stuck in my head he was a Report for America Corps member, and he did a story about the poorest county in Utah being double billed by a law firm. It's about $105,000, and simple article, and they published it, and they got a refund on their $105,000. So it wasn't like Watergate or secret torture sites or something like that. But it occurred to me that with that one article, that reporter, Zach Podmore, had made back for the county an amount 3 times his own annual salary. So when you start to think about it that way, strengthening local news from either a taxpayer or philanthropic point of view would pay for itself, at least in the global sense. So, but we're also careful about what are the ideas, what are the ways to do this that actually preserve the First Amendment and preserve editorial independence? Because there are a lot of ways one could do this that would go very badly, like having politicians being, giving out grants to news organizations that are covering them. You can easily imagine that would be catastrophic, right? That's not really the way you want to do this. But there's a whole history of this that goes all the way back to the Founding Fathers and the postal subsidy. The subsidy, they decided that in order to have a strong republic, you needed a strong newspaper industry. One of the first bills they enacted was a massive subsidy for the newspaper industry in the form of the postal subsidy. In current dollars, it would be worth about $40 billion a year, which is like the size of the NASA budget. And they were like, no, we got to do that. That's like, you need a strong newspaper industry to have a strong country. And what worked about that approach is it wasn't a bunch of, government officials sitting around deciding who to give money to. It was a universal benefit with very objective criteria, content neutral, not tied to content. So we have looked for policies of like, what are the 21st century versions of that? What are the ways that could be very safe, but also get at the problem? We, last session, worked on a payroll tax credit for news organizations that just was pegged to the number of reporters you had. It would have been really meaningful. It was $25,000 per head in the first year and $15,000 after that. There's a new federal bill that I really like that was just turned in 2 weeks ago by, on the House side, by a conservative Republican named Claudia Tenney and a Democrat named Suzanne DelBene. It's called the Community News and Small Business Support Act. We will probably just call it Tenney-DelBene because it rhymes and it's easier to remember. But it has 2 parts. One is what Don mentioned, a tax credit for small businesses that advertise in local news. So the tax credit actually goes to restaurants and auto dealers and dry cleaners if they advertise in local news. And it's got some real political appeal to it because it's basically a tax credit for small business. But it's geared toward priming the pump to get them or help them to advertise more in local news. The second piece of that bill is, again, the payroll tax credit idea. So right now, this whole coalition is working to try to get co-sponsors for that bill, especially Republican co-sponsors. And the Carol Miller is a target because she is on the Ways and Means Committee, which is where this bill lives. So any of you who happen to be in Carol Miller's district, if you felt like writing an editorial or making a call about her co-sponsoring the Tenney-DelBene bill, I know it might seem like a long shot, Maybe she doesn't have a long track record of being warm to the press. I don't know. You have to tell me that. But the bill has been introduced by Claudia Tenney, who is a very conservative, Trump-supporting Republican from upstate New York. So I think, asking her to support Claudia Tenney's bill to help small business might be worth a shot. But we're also realistic about federal government right now and the ability, you're just like they might not even be able to keep the lights on, let alone pass, great creative new things. So we're really focused on state legislatures. And we are looking with Don to see, what might be done in West Virginia. In most states, the state press associations and the folks have been kind of playing defense on legal notices. That's for very justifiable reasons. That's where a lot of the energy has to go, is to protect legal notices. And we're trying to pair that with some going on the offensive a little bit to say there's really a crisis in America that relates to the collapse of or the struggles of local news, and this really affects communities all over West Virginia and all over the country, and something ought to be done about it. Our policy menu, as we call it, at the coalition includes 6 different things. One is this idea of the small business tax credit. 2 is payroll tax credit. 3 is one that honestly is like really good in theory, but I don't think we've kind of figured out the mechanics of it yet, but it's a tax credit or some benefit for subscribers, so for people who subscribe to a newspaper. 4th is a idea that was really pioneered in New York, which was to make sure that a reasonable percentage of the government's advertising spending goes to local news. So this isn't the public notices. This is like public health campaigns and on the national level, military recruitment and census and things like that. So this is money the government's already spending. That's the political appeal of it, by the way. It's like you're not talking about new money. Money the government's already spending, and all we're saying is, hey, government is spending this money anyway. How about instead of some of the money going to Google and Facebook and national cable TV, you push some of it down toward local news. They did this in New York City, and it led to a really significant increase in the number of, in the amount of ad spending that went to community newspapers. So we're looking at that. And then the last idea that we're seeing pop up in a bunch of states is essentially kind of like a Report for America model. It's fellowships. So in Washington State, New Mexico, and California have just gotten the state governments to give the university system money to place journalists into local newsrooms through a fellowship program. But it's not just for like a week or two, it's like for 2 years. So it's significant enough that those reporters can have a meaningful impact on helping bulk up local newspaper staffs. And that's has some appeal because legislatures are used to dealing with the state university system. It's already a line item in the budget. They're already familiar with that. So, but I will say that the 2 that we get the most questions about, the 2 that seem to have the most political interest, are the government set-aside, ad set-aside, and as I said, I think that's largely because it doesn't involve any new money. And coming back to what Don said, this idea of the small business tax credit. So let me just spend 2 more minutes on that, partially to see what you think, because we're trying to figure out, do we want to really push hard on this? But it'll depend a little bit on what you all think and what small businesses think. So the idea again is and it would have to be shaped a little differently in each state depending on what the tax system is, but essentially a tax credit, not a tax deduction. So a tax credit is a benefit below the line of the taxes you pay. So if you were a restaurant that was going to at the end of the year pay $3,000 in taxes, under this bill you'd pay 0. And that would be, because of the tax benefit. And essentially, like on the federal bill, the way it's structured is it's up to $5,000. So if a small business wanted to spend $5,000 on an ad in the newspaper, they essentially could get $2,500 of that paid for through a tax credit. Or if they wanted to spend $10,000, they could get up to $5,000. So it's essentially a 50% discount, or a buy one, get one free approach. So the question is, would this move the needle? Like, are there small businesses that would be influenced by this? Like, it's, tax credits have disadvantages. Like, you'd have to spend the money now, but the benefit would come at when you get your tax refund 8 months later or something like that. So maybe some businesses, sounds good in theory or sounds good on paper, but maybe it's not practical, or maybe there's not enough. This is only for small businesses. So some people have said, God, in our community, like, all the small businesses have been bought up by chains or are chains, and so there aren't actually that many small businesses left in a community. So in each state, we've seen this bill come up in 4 different states, and they define small businesses in different ways. So the advantage of doing state bills is you can take the core idea and adjust it to your own circumstance. So, but I am really intrigued by this idea. The politics of it are much better. It seems a little less self-serving for media people. Some of these other things are the media going to ask for money for itself. This is sort of that, and we have to be unabashed about saying it's worth it, because democracy is depending on having local news. But in this case, it is a double benefit that can help small businesses to get back on their feet. A lot of times, having run a small business, when you're facing inflation or a downturn or something like that, one of the first things you cut is your marketing budget. But that creates a vicious cycle. You cut your marketing budget, you then have fewer customers, and your revenue goes down. So, in theory, it could be a really very valuable kind of form of help for small businesses. But, as I said, I think there's questions to talk through about whether or not it would kind of move the needle, or whether there's some other ideas. So we're hoping, that if we end up all trying to push on this, that you all would be able to help, and we talk to our members, our 25, 30 different coalition members who are all national and state organizations, and they have a variety of different levels of tolerance about this kind of stuff. Some of them just are happy to pick up the phone and call the senator or the congressman. Some people think, no, actually we don't want to do that. We'd rather do an editorial, because that's transparent. We can just be upfront about what we're doing, make the case. Some run op-eds, some do letters. Some just do news articles. There's a lot of different ways to have an influence on this. But I think the reality is that I think that our sector, the local news sector, is going to have to advocate for itself and for democracy through public policies that can strengthen local news. Not all public policies, by the way, involve subsidies. There's a lot of public policy issues that affect us, but in more indirect ways, like antitrust law. The ways in which the duopoly, or the power that Google and Facebook have over the ad market, leads to less revenue for local news. The way that 50% of all daily newspaper circulation now in America is owned by a hedge fund or a private equity fund. And in most of those situations, it has not been good for the community. They tend to cut the staffs more. That's an antitrust issue. I wish the antitrust regulators had been more aggressive in blocking some of the consolidation by financial firms. That's my opinion anyway. And broadband. Broadband, as you mentioned, there's $100 billion circulating out in America right now for broadband. Most of that is for access and affordability, but there is also a lot of money being set aside for what's called digital equity. And we have been making the case, we've identified hundreds of what we call double deserts. A double desert is a county that has neither broadband nor local news. And we've been sort of making the case that, hey, if you're going to, if you solve one problem, if you solve the broadband problem without solving the other problem, you will have high-speed access to garbage, and that you want to have, try to address both problems at the same time and deal with the news deserts as well. So those are just a few examples of things that don't involve, asking for direct financial help. But why don't I stop there and see if you have any questions? Yeah, it's the same dynamic, and in a way was one of the points of starting this coalition, is like there's a lot of ways in which different parts of the media environment have been pitted against each other, and that's fine, and there's still legitimate ways. We have nonprofits and for-profits in TV and radio, and that's going to happen. We have the labor unions and the publishers in our coalition, which is really fun, but we got together and said, well, this is one area where we actually have a common, newspapers and broadcasters and labor unions and publishers actually have a common interest here of saving local news. Well, the answer is it depends on which state you're looking at. That topic has been a hot issue. So in the federal bill, when they did the payroll tax credit, they kind of, the answer is yes-ish, in the sense that what they did was they said the tax credit would just go to a news organization that has local reporters. So yeah, it would include, Sinclair and Fox and public radio station, NPR and all that. But there'd be a limit of 1,500 slots per corporation. So it ended up limiting, but not excluding, the firms like the ones you're talking about. So that struck me as a reasonable compromise, because the thing about that we really wrestled with Report for America, even, of whether or not we would put reporters into some of those newsrooms, is like at the end of the day, you don't want to penalize the people in the community. Like they're the ones that need the news. So if you sort of, exclude the companies that you don't like, the damage may be done to the people in the community. And what we kind of liked about that payroll tax credit is at least it had the incentives in the right direction. If you're a hedge fund-owned newspaper and you cut your reporting staff, well, you're cutting your subsidy too. So it kind of creates a little bit of an incentive to grow. But it's a tough issue, and Connecticut, it was a different bill. It was a government ad set-aside thing, but they cheekily decided that they did this: 50% of Connecticut government advertising will go to locally owned media. So they knocked out, Connecticut, the Hartford Courant, the biggest paper in the state, they knocked out because it was owned by Waldman, Global Capital. And to me, that's a sort of local conditions question. Like if it's, if there's a political appetite and a will to do it that way, that's fine with me. But it's kind of a balancing act. It's a tough question. Part of what we say is that local news can't be allowed to be a dying industry. There may be particular models that are going to go away and get replaced by other things, but the concept of an America without local news is catastrophic. And it's not just about our jobs, it's about the basic functioning of communities. And we can't sidestep that argument. Like, we got to be able to make that argument. Some people will say that's BS, but that is, the heart of it. Now, we have tried to pick policies that also have other advantages to it, like the small business tax credit. Well, it's actually the advertiser who's going to decide who gets the subsidy, not the government.
Thank you.